I don't think we could call it a meeting anymore. It's sort of a set of meetings. And today we have the topic of audit evidence. I think at the outset of the week, I said there were a number of topics where we needed a clear direction on to give the board a sense of what's next, and the public what's next. And audit evidence is one of those topics. We addressed LCE earlier in the week. This is a topic I know that's been around for some bit of time. Even when I attended as an observer a year ago, the discussion of a potential project on audit evidence was on the board's agenda. And since then, it's clear that the working group has done quite a bit of work in terms of research and understanding what's out there. And as I remember the questions that were posed, I think the paper in front of you clearly addresses what are the top issues in an effort to scope any potential project appropriately. So we welcome a really robust discussion today to give us a clear direction on the path forward. And with that, I turn it to Bob.
Okay, thanks, Tom, and welcome everybody. Looking forward to a great discussion today. I think Tom's introduction is very appropriate. As you know, we've been around with this topic for some time now, and I think you'll see the amount of work that's been done as we go forward. In that regard, there's been a tremendous amount of information that we're going to discuss today in summary form. The working group, because we haven't been with the board since a year ago, June of 2009, the working group has been working extremely hard. That's Kaiui, Martin, and of course Wolf helping out with that. Eric and Susan Jones and Jamie Shannon, and then Phil and Jasper as staff have done a tremendous job. So maybe to get into today's session, I could provide a little bit of a brief background and overview, I guess, of the plan for our time together today. As I mentioned, the last time the audit evidence project was on the board agenda in full form was a year ago, June of 2019. If you recall, during that meeting, the working group had already been hard at work and had gone through the IAASB kind of from front to back and identified issues, a laundry list, if you will, of different issues where the working group thought there was an opportunity for those matters to be addressed, especially in the context of today's business environment, and included some proposed actions or alternatives to address those issues. It was during that board meeting that we had a really good discussion. I think it led to a consensus from the board that the working group go back and do some extended work to try to get a better handle and more information on whether the nature of the issues that had been identified were appropriate, and root cause analysis in some cases, but to do more broad outreach in that regard. And that gave rise then to the audit evidence workstream plan. Of course, that's been posted to the website for some time. That was shared with the board subsequent to the June meeting. And really, the working group and the workstream plan that was approved comprised of a three-pronged, essentially a three-pronged approach to further information gathering and research, with an objective of coming back to the board by actually June 2020. So we're right on schedule, coming back to the board with informed recommendations about how to proceed with this project. The three primary elements, I guess, of the extended information gathering and research consisted of targeted outreach, and then some other activities. We looked at academic research as well as monitoring the activities of national standard setters, regulators, public accounting organizations, member bodies, so on and so forth. And with an eye, keeping an eye on the AICPA's Audit Evidence project that was running concurrently with this work. That plan, that work stream plan, then gave rise essentially to what you see as Agenda Item 7, the discussion paper. It's a robust, complete summary of the Audit Evidence Working Group activities and the results and information that we've been able to assemble and support some of the issues that have been identified. There's like 7 appendices to the discussion paper, so all of the details supporting the primary portion of the paper is there, as well as we provided 3 supplemental papers that we won't discuss today, but those are supplemental and provide more information and detail on the content in the main section of the paper. We're going to take it that you've read the discussion paper, so we're not going to go through detail by detail, but rather we want to briefly cover and overview the primary elements of the information gathering and research, as Tom stated, with an ultimate objective by the end of our session today to get a clear direction from the board as to whether you agree with our recommended actions that will allow us to proceed in December to come back with a project proposal for approval, but also in the meantime, keep work moving along those recommended actions so that we don't spend the next 6 months without progressing the project in itself. So with that as the kind of the introduction, I guess we can move to the next slide, Armand, and start right into the first primary area of our information gathering and research, and that was targeted outreach. I have to start probably before we get to the slide, give it a little bit of background here. The outreach that we conducted, and if you look at page 3 of the discussion paper and Appendix 3 of the discussion paper, you can get all the detail about exactly who we conducted outreach with. But it totaled 39 organizations. And included regulatory and oversight bodies. That included the Central European Oversight Body, IFIAR, and IAASB. We talked to many national standard setters. What was really great about the national standard setters was their cooperation and their agreement not only to provide their input, but also to distribute our background paper and kind of survey their members at the actually out in field, so real life auditors to get their feedback. So even though we say 39 organizations were contacted in outreach, it was actually many, many more individuals because of the cooperation of the national standard setters. We also talked to many, many firms, all of the GPPC firms, as well as other members of the Forum of Firms, and had extended discussions with IFAC's SMPC. We talked to public sector, Jim and Greg Goodman from Intosci, and talked to member bodies, PAOs, and also the FEI as a preparer. So really a lot of outreach conducted over an extended period of time and a vast and rich amount of information gathered. So the way that we conducted the outreach was essentially we prepared a background paper. As you might expect, the paper had background and history of the project, provided some context, and essentially consisted of 4 questions that we were interested in getting responses to, and then also contained a listing of the identified possible issues that the board had discussed in June 2019. Now, I'd point out, if any of you, I know we've got a lot of auditors on the board and TAs and things like that. If you went back and looked at the list that we had in June 2019 and compared it to the list that we included in our background paper, you would see that they are not identical, there's different numbers. That's simply because at the board's direction, some of the issues from a year ago were allocated to the technology working group to address, and then some just lended themselves to consolidation and summarization. So, but essentially the underlying issues discussed with the board in June were included in the background paper in one shape or another. So with respect to the first question that we asked in our outreach, it was asking the people that we were talking to about what issues create the most difficulties for them in practice. And we've summarized on the screen here essentially where the working group thinks the primary themes were. I would say just, you know, at a high level, there were very few issues that were included in our background paper that, you know, stakeholders didn't think were important. But we really didn't think it was helpful to the board discussion today to present a long list in the main body and say they were all important, but rather to come away and, from a working group's view anyway, try to summarize what we believe the 5 most common important issues cited were, and we'll go through those. The only 2 issues that we had in the background paper that people weren't real excited about was around subsequent events, 560, and going concern, 570. Now, I think that was a little bit ironic. It probably indicates that most of our outreach had concluded by the time COVID-19 broke, or I suspect we may have had a little more interest in 570 on going concern. But otherwise, all of the issues were cited as being important. If we're to summarize by stakeholder group, I think accounting firms generally expressed concern that there was a tendency on their part to under-rely on technology. And we'll get into some of the reasons perhaps when we talk about some of the academic research for that. And that the issues that create the most difficulties in practice, if we had to pick one, were closely related to the evaluation or the concepts involved with what is meant by sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And in today's environment, what does the auditor consider and evaluate in trying to draw those conclusions? So you can see, you know, kind of springing off that, then the 5 most commonly issued highlighted difficulties in practice. There was a big group, a common theme around professional skepticism and judgment when evaluating sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. There was also a lot of question and discussion around what factors or attributes in today's environment should auditors be thinking about in drawing their conclusions about whether they've obtained sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So I think that was important to recognize. Certainly the reliability of information was at top of mind, and I think reflective perhaps of today's environment, a lot of discussion around how you get at reliability of information depending on whether it's an internal source, entity source, or whether it's information obtained from external sources. So I know we addressed some of that with the 540 project, but clearly still top of mind for the stakeholders here. Technology, of course, comes to the top. I think when we get to some of our recommended actions, you'll see 330, ISA 330 came up a lot. There were some specific commonly asked questions. One of them we have here is whether an automated tool or technique or technology can be used to perform a procedure that constitutes both a risk assessment procedure and a substantive procedure concurrently. I think as we mentioned on Monday, that's actually been kind of farmed off to the technology working group for some non-authoritative support material. that should be coming out soon, but that's a common theme that came through. And then lastly, again, related to technology, when technology is used to examine or perform procedures on vastly larger populations of information, the extent of testing required on exceptions that are noted in those processes was also raised as a significant issue. So I think, Armand, maybe move to the next slide. And these are the other 3 questions. Again, we had 4 total questions in our outreach paper. So what we just went through was the issues cited as being the most prevalent or important to stakeholders. We also asked, was our list of issues complete? From the stakeholders' view, were there other things, other elements, other topics that we had missed that they are dealing with that should be added to the project? And you can see there were 2 that came through commonly here. The first one actually has to do not so much with what's in ISA 500, but what is not in ISA 500. And that is a kind of explanation or a correlation of how ISA 315, ISA 330, and ISA 500 tie together, correlate, interact, and work with respect to audit evidence. Of course, 315, risk assessment procedures provide evidence. 330, certainly we obtain evidence performing procedures. And it's actually in 330 where the requirement to draw the overall conclusion about whether sufficient appropriate evidence has been obtained lies. So stakeholders commonly ask for the standards to be more clear about what the actual objective or role of 500 is and how it relates to those 2 principal standards, 315 and 330. And then another topic that we had not addressed, but came through fairly commonly. I don't think it was expected, really, but there was a lot of feedback around using electronic platforms and external confirmation processes. So we know that there's aspects of that addressed in ISA 505, but I would say there were questions around electronic evidence in general. And particularly the definition of what constitutes a confirmation and how that might apply in today's world when technology and the ability to access different portals for information and things like that actually might work. Question 3 then was, how are the firms, regulators, national standard setters, and PAOs dealing with the issues? So we asked those stakeholder groups, if they have any activity that's taking place at their level. I would say by and large, not a lot going on. The national standard setters, really outside of the AICPA in the US, not a lot of standard setting going on in this arena. However, certainly when you get to some of the member bodies and the firms, there's a lot of training and education, especially around technology, taking place. And then the last question we asked in outreach was, what actions do you think the IAASB should take? And generally, the responses came back that there was, either tremendous support for revising ISA 500, including some conforming and consequential amendments, or developing non-authoritative guidance to address the issues while that standard setting process is taking place. So that was the general feedback that was by and large obtained, and we'll come back to how that relates to our working group recommendations. There were some other views. There were 2 stakeholders, one GPPC firm and one preparer, who did not believe that standard setting was necessary with respect to ISA 500, and that rather The issues could be addressed with non-authoritative support material. And then there was some other feedback from stakeholders that went essentially around, especially with respect to professional skepticism and professional judgment, that there should be an expansion of application material around those concepts. And then from the SMP committee, a specific caution, as you might expect, against automation bias in the standards, depending on the direction of the standard setting. So the outreach essentially was geared around 3 primary changes or drivers of change. Focus on professional skepticism, expanding sources of information that are available to auditors today, and then lastly, technology. How does technology play with evidence, both from the preparer's use of technology as well as the auditor's use of technology? So that moves us to the first question that we have for the board today. Armand, there you go. And that has to do, it's on page 11 in your discussion paper, and it has to do specifically with the targeted outreach. And we're asking whether the board agrees with the conclusion that the issues, the working group's conclusions that the issues creating the most difficulties are really around the sufficiency, appropriateness of audit evidence. And if you look at Appendix 4, I think that's probably the most critical appendix in our discussion paper, because that is the list of topics or issues that the working group will ultimately propose to take action on. And we'd also like your view whether, based on the outreach conducted with our stakeholders, that list of issues in Appendix 4 remains appropriate. And if the list in Appendix 5 is appropriate to leave off the recommended actions going forward. So Appendix 5 are issues that we heard in outreach that the working group did not think had enough support broadly to add to a project plan. So with that, Tom, I'll hand back to you and ask for board feedback on the stakeholder outreach.
And refresh my memory, the implication is that those issues directly relate to ISO 500, right? And
yeah,
therefore, any project would be to be scoped to really focus on 500 rather than do a broad overview of all the standards and tackle them broad.
Yes, if you look at Appendix 4, as I said, that's critical. It's broken down into our primary recommendation. That would be the project that we would take forward. And there's issues that are category A, action A items, which involve a standard setting project with 500 and conforming and consequential amendments to essentially 330 and maybe 315. And then action item B is non-authoritative support material that we could work on while the standard setting project is underway. So there are things that maybe we could address non-authoritatively in the interim. And so that's what Appendix 4 is, Tom.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for that. I just think that's an important point to make. Okay. Anyone else anyone want to jump in first? There you go, Fiona. Don't let me down.
No, I'll kick off. Thank you, Bob. Thank you for the paper. I found myself, as I was reading the paper, nodding and agreeing and going, yes, yes, yes. And obviously we can always come up with more issues for you to focus on, but certainly agree with both of those first 2 sub-bullets under question 1 as to whether or not these are the issues that are causing the most concern, absolutely. And whether you've got the top 5 ones right, absolutely. So yes and yes for both of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Sue?
Hi, thank you, Bob. There's obviously been a huge amount of outreach there, and certainly in the discussions I've had in preparing for this meeting, consistent feedback there. I think, as Fiona said, you could build more onto the list. There's lots of challenges, but I think that the prioritization there is good. The only slight piece of feedback I had was around the technology area, simply in relation to how some of this fits, whether the technology group can adequately deal with some of the challenges, or whether they need to come back into the 500 challenges. But certainly I support the prioritization and the work there. Thank you.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you for this great work, and we can see step after step and year after year that we are getting more and more feedback from stakeholders on what really needs to be done. So that's a really good direction. I have a comment and a question. My comment relates to what you raised, and that is also outlined in point O, which is the last point of Appendix 5, and it's also referred to as point 17 of Appendix 4, which is the use of electronic platform. And I want to remind, because I had the privilege to be seated in the boardroom at that time, so that the IAASB has already released in November 2009 a staff audit practice alert dealing with emerging practice issues regarding the use of external confirmation in an audit of financial statements. And in that staff paper, there was already something on use of technology in the confirmation process, dealing specifically with the use of platform. So I'm sure we can build on what has been written at that time. I'm not aware that many things and many issues have changed since that time. So well, maybe we will not reinvent the wheel on that topic, because we already had some clear ideas on what was acceptable and what was not. Then my questions relate to the interconnection of the part which is presenting the 5 key issues, and then Appendix 4 and 5. In the 5 key issues, there's a reference twice, I think it's in page 6, yes, to the development of a framework that can be applied to assess the information used as audit evidence. And when I read what is proposed in Appendix 4, I don't see any reference to this framework. So I'm not sure if what we are proposing, and maybe I'm in anticipation already of question 5, but are we proposing to include the development of a framework for assessment of audit evidence as part of issues we are trying to fix in Appendix 4? Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Chun-Wei?
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, Bob, for your introductory comments. It is very evident that the working group has done a tremendous amount of work since we last had Audit Evidence working group with us on the agenda. So kudos to you, kudos to the working group, and of course the staff as well. So fantastic work there. I very much support where we've landed in terms of the list of issues, and I agree with the proposal in terms of going forward with opening up the standard and to do work on that basis. I would like to seek a clarification, actually. So looking at Appendix 4, we have proposed action A and then proposed action B. So when I was reading paragraph 28, and I think you were explaining it as well, some of our stakeholders are saying, well, opening up a standard and then going through the standard setting process necessarily takes time. Some of these are really living, breathing, real life issue that people are grappling at this moment. And I saw in paragraph 28 that some of our stakeholders arrived at some kind of compromise, which is that some of these issues will be taken and we will look into non-authoritative guidance on those discrete issues in the interim. So when I was looking at Appendix 4, I was trying to look for those issues where we have A and B sort of together, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So we have all the A's and then we have the B, which are sort of taken out and I guess parked with the technology working group. So I was, I guess, slightly confused there. And just looking at that list, I think you highlighted the top 5 issue in the paper. And looking at the list, I think there are a few very clear candidates in my mind for that kind of non-authoritative guidance in the interim, like 14C or part of 6C or even things like 6B. So just I guess, seeking clarification in terms of what is the working group's plan with that regards. And even looking at Appendix 5 as well. And I think the working group has again done a tremendous job in pulling together this very good depository of issues that people have fed back to us. And I see that in Appendix 5, again, we have allocation 1, 2, and 3, and 1 belongs to a subset of Appendix 4 as well. So again, some of these discrete issues, I guess, again, looks like good candidate to pull out for non-authoritative guidance. So I just want to seek clarification on that. And in relation to the allocation to the category 3, where we say these issues are not within the scope of Appendix 4, and the issue may be considered as part of the IAASB forward work plan. Now, I agree with that. I guess my question is, how are we then tracking these for the forward work plan, just to make sure that we don't lose track of them, given that clearly we have a lot of activities going on. It's often quite easy for things to slip through the cracks. And looking at some of those in category 3, actually some looks like good candidate for non-authoritative guidance as well. So I just want to share my, I guess, questions in those areas. But again, very supportive. Thank you so much for all the fantastic work done.
Thanks, Shenwei. I think some of those questions will be addressed as we get to question 5 for today, based upon categorization. If I'm
okay. Sorry for jumping ahead.
No, it's okay. You've placed it on the table, but it shows that I just want to say when Bob responds, he probably won't respond to that till we get to the fuller conversation about our question 5. Lynn, with a Y.
Thank you. First of all, Bob, congratulations to you and the team for very thorough research and outreach. It's very impressive what you've done in the time. In terms of your 2 questions, I agree with your conclusions and also the list in Appendix 4. It's very similar to the research we did in New Zealand, and well, not unsurprisingly, the issues were very much the same. I also, and I know this is further down, but I just want to agree with Isabel, the framework concept, I missed somehow, it confused me exactly what you were talking about. So I just put it on the table now in case my brain doesn't make it to 2 a.m. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Josephine?
Thank you. And Bob, similar to Lynn, thank you for all this thorough outreach. Very impressive. And on the whole, I agree with the priorities. Bob, I probably have about 8 points that I want to make overall about this paper, and some of them fall across questions 1 to 4. So Do you want me to just go through those now? Because I can't really compartmentalize them into each of the questions. Or do you want me to wait till we get towards the end?
I'm wondering, Josephine, I think when we get through this round, we'll move fairly quickly through the other information gathering research activities. So maybe if you hold those until questions 2, 3, and 4, and then we can pick up 1 also. Will that work?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Sachika?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much for some explanation, Bob. As others, I support 2 bullets in question 1. I particularly like the analysis described in paragraph 19, and that is very, very consistent with what I heard from practitioners in Japan. So I really support that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Len?
Sorry. Thank you, Bob. I thought that was a great presentation and a great paper and all the outreach event you did. I thought when you did the outreach with IAASB in February, I thought at least the members were quite impressed with the background information. I guess a lot of members wasn't caught up with the work, but after your presentation, I think they understand the issues and linking to other standards and some of the practical challenges. I'm fully supportive of what you presented in Appendix 4 and 5, but maybe just one area I didn't see, but I think might be covered already is fraud. I know later on in the supplement, you had identified fraud as part of the technology solution or some of the practical challenges. But 315, 330, I think you hit it right, and the sufficient appropriate of the evidence. But fraud is such an important issue that actually quite linked to all the evidence. So that's my only other comments. Otherwise, it's very good and comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you. Roger?
Thanks, and congratulations, Bob. This is a great example of evidence-based standard setting. You've gone and done a good job of doing the research in the area. Extremely supportive of both bullet points and the lists in Appendix 4 and Appendix 5, so thank you.
Thanks. We're about halfway through. Bob, do you want to take these comments on, or should we continue?
Tom, maybe if I could ask a couple of them that have come up more frequently. The first question I want to get back to is Chun-Wei and the question about Appendix 4, because I think we will refer to Appendix 4 quite often. And Chun-Wei, I got your point or your question about why you were looking for more of those issues to have both an action A and a B. And that is the intent. So, for example, if an item is identified for action B, that is the development of non-authoritative support material while the broader standard setting project is taking on. So it's a more immediate response, but that topic would certainly be included in the scope then of the standard setting project itself. So just clarification, when you see a B in Appendix 4, it's A and B should be read together. And the Isabel, with respect to the electronic confirmation, thank you for the reminder about the practice alert. I think some of the questions we got back on the electronic platform dealt more with almost the definition of what constitutes a confirmation. So there were questions, for example, if a client gives an auditor the password to access their bank information online, is that the same as a bank confirmation? And so it was those types of questions more than actually what was dealt with in the practice alert. But thank you for the reminder. And then I think both Isabel as well as Lynn mentioned the framework question. That is, a little bit different. It certainly is included in the Appendix 4 Action A items, but throughout the document, it's referenced more as the factors or attributes that would be considered with respect to evaluating reliability of information. So it's concepts like accuracy and completeness and risk of bias associated or susceptibility to bias and authenticity and precise, detailed, cooperative, contradictory, all of those types of terms. So framework needs to be more work done by the working group, whether it ultimately would be a framework or whether it ultimately would be a list of considerations or factors remains to be seen. We just haven't progressed quite that far yet. So to clear that up. And then Len, maybe very quickly on the fraud topic, we did reference this a little bit quickly or rapidly on Monday with the technology working group. Fraud is there, but we're aware, all of us, that of course staff have this other project going on with fraud and going concern. So I think the staff is coordinating technology, evidence, fraud, going concern in developing a plan to address that, but certainly a good reminder. Otherwise, Tom, I think we can continue.
Thank you. Imran.
Chairman, thank you very much. My apologies about missing last night's discussion. I believe it went very well. And I appreciate all the messages of support I got from board members, but I'm back and everything's fine again. Bob, good morning and thank you for your presentation. I have some introductory messages, but I want to kick it off by saying that I think that the work that your group led by you have done is really just superb and outstanding. I think for as long as the 500 project runs at the board, this will be your legacy, and we'll always call it Bob's project. I took from the paper, Bob, that other than answering yes to both of your questions, that the board gave your group quite a tough set of things to do when we last met, and that the team has really very faithfully followed the board's direction, and I think in some ways done more than we could have hoped. Real credit to you around this information gathering exercise that you've done. It's easy to ask for it. It's extremely difficult to execute it, and to do this type of outreach, including all of the regional outreach you did that we're aware of across, for example, many jurisdictions in Africa. Really credit to you on doing this, and it's great to see that the results confirm all of the board's original thinking. I also think it's fair to say that as I read the paper, and as Fiona says, you nod your head, but you also appreciate how much of work has gone into this, recognizing that I think we were only due to discuss this in September, and to have it brought forward by a whole quarter to us to have this conversation today, really a credit to you and to Phil and everyone else who contributed to this paper. I'm really grateful for it. I want to add just one point, and that the framework issue that you described in issue 1 sounded like a really good idea. Looking forward to seeing that appear in Appendix 4, wherever else. But otherwise supportive of everything over here, and really no big omissions to describe. Although I wish you would add a little bit of favor to your thoughts around the documentation here. The documentation discussion, which I think appears in paragraph 20, I lost my paragraph reference, kind of leaves me unsure about what the outcome is going to be of the documentation discussion. And I wonder how we would be able to open 500 without addressing some of the documentation matters. But otherwise, very supportive and a strong yes and yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Imran. Kai Morton.
Thank you, and thank you, Bob, and the working group for the papers being prepared. First of all, I want to say that I support both questions. as Imran just alluded to, I think this is a really important project with relation to documentation as well. So it's a really close link. And when practitioners say that they have difficulties with the documentation requirements, I think it's many times it's the evidence piece that they're hard to figure out what to do. And same with the technology. I think it's important to keep a close connection with both of those projects as well. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kai. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. Like others, congratulations to the working group and Bob with your leadership. I think you're targeting my 105 outreach events for 540, because 39 and easily gets you on a really good start. So that's great. I think this type of a topic needs outreach. If I look at this first question, I fully agree that most of the issues around evidence is around the sufficiency and appropriateness of audited evidence. But I do wonder if it's more about, do they understand that concept, or if it's really about the evaluation of what it is and specifically how much is enough. I think that's, we hear this a lot, and I think that's something that I would look at a successful project if we can give some information, some guidance on how that can come across. I think that's where people have the hardest time knowing what is enough. Similar to Sue's comment, I struggle with the splitting of technology and evidence. I understand you have to make a cut, but a lot of the stuff that's in technology, I think, does come across. I do look at Appendix 4 and I see there is technology in there, so it's not like it's not there, but that fine line between what technology is going to do and what evidence is going to do. I'm not sure that will get there in the end. And so clearly, I think there's a tie that needs to continue. I said the same thing on Monday, but I also wouldn't want to shy away from something that really would impact the Audit Evidence project if that's what comes out of technology as it moves along. On the list of Appendix 4 and what you did in the slides, I think it's a comprehensive summary. I think it's complete. I don't have anything else to add to it other than the comment about technology. I guess the question is are we biting off too much though? We have it open, so we should do it, but we need to realize that it's a long list, and we're going to do it. Then we need to make sure that you have the right team to support you. And there's a lot of time on the board's agenda to make sure that gets done. And then I would also just say I fully agree with the 5 issues most commonly highlighted. I think those are the ones I hear, and those are the ones I see in practice. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Julie.
Good morning. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for the introduction and all the outreach that you undertook. I was part of a couple of those calls, so I know how much time and effort that took. Certainly, yes to the questions that you have under question 1. It is a comprehensive list. It's things we hear every day. And in fact, in the COVID era, it's become really obvious what a lot of evidence issues have popped up. Some that have been around for a while and some that are a bit new. So it's sort of the topic of the day, so to speak. I also had flagged the framework as part of my notes. So you've already addressed that comment, but we were interested to see what that might look like, because I think, if that could be worked on, that might be quite helpful for practitioners to work through when they come across audit evidence issues. On your list, I'll sort of echo what Rich said about it being quite long, and it is comprehensive. On your list of top 5, and there was also another one later on in your longer list, I tripped over the one in particular that talks about the auditor responding to assessed risks. And, you know, in your top 5, it's the last one, it's number 5. And it talks about the analysis of larger populations. And I see a similar theme again in a couple of other places in your longer list. It feels like we might be sort of branching off into something that's a little more prescriptive as a response to that issue. No doubt the issue around responding to risks and using data and larger populations is challenging, but that one in itself felt a lot more prescriptive and was maybe taking judgment out of the hands of the auditor on how to deal with certain issues, as opposed to your 1 through 4, I'll call them, on your top 5, that felt like more akin to a standard setting or principles-based approach to addressing them. So there were a couple of them that I just flagged that maybe we were walking a fine line there between providing principles-based guidance and standards to help auditors deal with issues, as opposed to providing a more prescriptive response to how to deal with it. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando?
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Bob. And as said, it's very impressive, the outreach and the amount of information that you gathered. It's really difficult to argue reading the list of issues that we as auditors, we're not really facing that. It's a reality. We struggle with all these topics. However, I think not every jurisdiction is really having the same issues. Some of them are still adopting ISAs, others do not use a lot of technology. Firms are at different levels, but definitely as the firms evolve in the future, those topics will be very relevant. So I'm very supporting of the list of all the issues that you identified. Thanks.
Thank you. Yosh.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for the very interesting paper, because as Roger mentioned, this paper is very proof-based paper. So I'm very interested in it. And I have just commented Appendix 4, especially the nature of audit evidence. I generally supported the working group project with the primary purpose of the revising ISA 500. But in the consideration, in the consideration of the revision of ISA 500, the discussion of the concept of persuasive as audit evidence will be important. For example, ISA 330, paragraph 7b requires more persuasive audit evidence in details. It defines the nature of audit evidence as persuasive, similar to the PCAOB or AICPA audit standards shown at the Appendix 7 usual. Especially in addition, because of COVID-19, there have been cases in Japan. Maybe Sachiko knows much more than me currently, where audit evidence has been obtained through alternative or remote procedure. We would like the working group to consider such proceedings where procedures cannot be carried out as normally or as scheduled, which affect the characteristics or nature of audit evidence. And in addition, the collection of this confirming evidence and the evaluation of not only piece of audit evidence, but also overall audit evidence like an affirmative or indirect evidence are increasingly required, I think. Thank you, that's it.
Thank you. That was the last of the hands up, Bob. I think we've heard from mostly everyone. I'm hearing broad support for this on this question. One of the topics that was new that you had addressed related to documentation in this round. So maybe you or Billy could address that. Josephine, were you trying to come back in?
Yeah, I mean, on reflection, I mean, most of the points that I was going to raise are in relation to the first part of the paper anyway. Okay. And as there were some other considerations by others, I've got some as well. So okay. I thought best to pop in now.
Okay.
And then hopefully you won't hear from me again for the rest of the meeting. Just a couple of points. When we are thinking about building project proposal and bringing in some of this wording that we have in this paper into that, because naturally we do that. We have a tendency to do that. Just have a couple of points to make. On paragraph 17, On the point that accounting firms note that regulatory perceptions can potentially discourage auditors from using automated tools and techniques, I'd like not to imply in our papers that regulators are discouraging firms. So let's assume first that the challenges that are made by regulators are actually valid, and then address the need for appropriate standards and address those concerns if that's necessary. So we need to, as you move forward, you need to dig deeper into what those challenges are, what the challenges expressed by accounting firms are, and then what we could do with that. Then on the 5 issues, that's at the second box on paragraph 19, second bullet. There was a reference to a document in a footnote, but I couldn't actually find that. But I fear without context, this implies that stakeholders may be seeking to reverse the great work done in addressing this issue by the 540 and 315 task forces. So I think we need to be clear what we meant there, which wasn't that you have to seek out in all cases. It's about when obtaining audit evidence, you should perform that in an unbiased manner. So I think we need to be clear about that. And then on that next bullet, we also heard this in our outreach. So that's about the development of the framework that others have mentioned. So I thought it might be useful to have a deep dive into what that was, but I read that more around the framework that we have, the framework idea that's been built into the EER paper on evidence. So maybe connect with the EER task force on that point. And just a general point, Bob, that I've noticed with the other outreach that you've done and with the conclusions, that it's implied that audit evidence is generated by the auditor is actually only generated from risk assessment procedures and further audit procedures. But in fact, audit evidence is anything that the auditor uses in making the judgments and decisions that lead them obviously to their conclusions. So the auditor can actually obtain audit evidence when you carry out other procedures in other standards, like including the quality management standards. So that's something I'd like the working group to think about when they're progressing the work here. I'm nearly there. On box 3, first bullet, there's an example there which talks about a broader focus than quantity, e.g. the strength of credibility, and that also links to maybe thinking about the definitions of sufficiency and appropriateness. I'm struggling to understand what that means, because strength or credibility to me means relevance and reliability. So just there is caution generally about changing those definitions, but we definitely need a deeper dive into what people really mean by strength and credibility, if it's not just relevance and reliability. On the next bullet down, there's information and data. Again, the ISO 540 task force spent a lot of time on this topic. I'm sure you remember it, Rich. So whatever we do here, we should be consistent with these terms and also remember their relevance. So I might take data and perform some analysis of it, and it becomes information in accordance with 540. Then I might pass that to someone else, and it then becomes their data they perform further analysis on. So I think just caution not to overcomplicate that. And then on the next box, which is aspects of issue 6C in Appendix 4, on that second bullet, I agree with the comment about complexities about gaining access, but access is not just a question of availability. There's also a cost associated with that. And we do cover some of that in ISO 200. We do cover cost, but it might be worth exploring whether we need something more in ISO 540. So a higher cost may be justified when the evidence otherwise available is not going to be sufficient and appropriate evidence. So maybe draw out some of that in as you progress. And then the only other points I have is on assertions more generally. So something that's not really there, our inspections teams still face situations today where teams struggle to articulate the purpose of or the aim of the procedure they're undertaking. And that's not just in relation to automated procedures. So we think more could be done in the application material to explain how assertions relate to misstatements And also where else we make assertions, maybe we can think about, risk assessment procedures. What are the assertions there? And then on the other audit procedures, what would the assertions be there? And perhaps clarify that a little bit more. And my very final point, everybody will be relieved. Both our enforcement and inspections teams felt that there really does need to be a stronger link between the ability to exercise professional skepticism and assigning the right people to the work. Now, we've done a lot of that in 220, but something that links 500 to 220 so that we can ensure that we reduce those cases where very junior staff members are still carrying out quite complex work with insufficient supervision. And that's it. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Back to you.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Josephine. Maybe just quickly on a couple of your points. The point about being careful about when we get to standard setting and things like that, about regulators discouraging. Totally agree with that. Would not be something to put in a standard. That was just simply reporting back feedback or input that we had received from stakeholders. So some hold that view, but certainly wouldn't end up in a standard. The other points, totally agree. Absolutely, quality management, client acceptance, continuance, all generates audit evidence. I think your point about the definitions and relevance and reliability, credibility. One thing that came through in our outreach was the number of different adjectives people use to describe these basic concepts of relevance and reliability. And that plays into that framework idea. Quite honestly, the working group has not explored that deeply enough to develop the framework at this point, but it is central to the definitions and what people consider or believe are attributes or factors of relevant and reliable information. Tom, maybe just circling back, documentation, I agree. Documentation was an issue, came through with Imran and Kai Morton and others. So we will look at the interaction between 500 and 230. It has been discussed at a high level with the working group, and I think maybe what I'd like to do is just invite Billy if you've got any views on that, on the broader plan.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. So you're quite right. It's been pointed out in the issues paper in paragraph 25 that ISO 230 documentation has been raised. I think the reference that was made here in the issues paper is just to point out that we have, to an extent, addressed some of the issues with the non-authoritative guidance that was issued by the technology working group. But I do also just want to remind the board that in the issues paper that we had on, where did we have it? On Tuesday, on the audits of LCE's project. In there, in paragraph 15, the issue of documentation was also touched on. So to a large part, I think what we need to accept is that the documentation, and it's not just documentation in ISO 230, it is documentation across the ISAs, will be addressed as part of the CUSP project, the Complexity, Understanding, Scalability, Proportionality project, or as it was termed in the issues paper, the ISA focused work stream, where it was also acknowledged that that would be part of the work of that working group to look at documentation requirements, documentation across the ISAs, and with the possibility that as we go along, there might be a need for a type of an interim solution in terms of non-authoritative material. I think we need to just be very clear that for purposes of this project, there must be no expectation that we will also open up to 30, because we do think when it comes to the documentation, it is obviously 230, but it goes towards how documentation is addressed across the standard. So I think we need to give the ISA focus works a chance to work with that. And as Bob said, just see how the interaction is between 500 and 230.
Thank you, Willy. And then before moving on, just a couple of quick things. Rich, I totally agree. This, where you cross the line with technology and audit evidence is going to be something that we have to look at very closely. Julie, absolutely, don't get too prescriptive. I think we're very much focused on principles and frameworks and evaluation and things like that. So certainly we'll stay away from prescriptiveness. And Yosh, you brought up the concept of persuasiveness, which is one that the working group has discussed in the context of how 330 relates to 500, but how also the concepts of sufficiency and appropriateness relate to persuasiveness also. So we will certainly explore that. And then lastly, before I go any further, sincerely thank everyone for the compliments about the extensive outreach and the work done and everything. I just have to say, kudos to Phil. Phil has been with this since the beginning, and you guys all know that it's the staff that does the heavy lifting with the outreach. Phil did all the scheduling, all that sort of thing, and I just had to show up to have the discussion. So Phil and Brett has been involved, in Jasper. Those people deserve all the credit for that. So if we could then move to covering off the other elements of our information and gathering and research. Armand, if we could move to the next slide. Section 2 of the paper deals with the academic research. And I have to, give a special recognition to Kaiui, who has really led this kind of substream for us at the working group level. Certainly his academic background was critical in helping us to identify and locate the academic research that we looked at. And of course, that's all listed in Appendix 6 to the paper. With respect to the scope, we look at research. Primarily, most of the research in this area is related to use of technology. Very little real research directly on audit evidence itself. So a lot of the research actually was focused more on technology. And of course, being academic research, some oriented more towards theory and observations and things like that. So the key findings that we looked or took away from academic research, generally concerned the use of technology by the auditor, but also mixed views about whether the standards that we currently have today adequately address technology. And again, technology being a bit of a surrogate for audit evidence for research purposes. And then a lot of indications in the research that pointed to there's a perception that auditors are resistant to using technology because of questions about whether the standards adequately address the characteristics of sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So I think if you look at the results or if you had the opportunity to read all of this research, I think what it essentially boils down to is we believe that the academic research didn't reveal any new issues from what we have included in Appendix 4 or in our back paper for outreach. Some of the literature said things like the lack, because the ISAs are not specific and don't address technology, that very lack of constraint, you can be two ways. Either it's permissive or it raises questions about whether it's appropriate or whether you'd be challenged in using that. So a lot of it related to using big data. I think how I would summarize this, I think, is if we go back to our data analytics working group request for input back in 2016, one of the conclusions that we reached in our feedback statement was that the ISAs aren't broken and should remain principle-based, but need to be updated to reflect the digital era. And I think that's a fair summary of what the academic research pointed to, was that perhaps technology would be used more if it was addressed within the standards itself, although there's nothing that prohibits its use currently. So the academic research was valuable. Armand, maybe move to the next slide, if we could. This deals with section 3 of the paper, which is really the monitoring of the activities of firms and regulators, national standard setters, and PAOs. So we looked at, in outreach, we inquired and had discussions with firms and bodies that we've listed here, the organizations. As I mentioned earlier, by and large, national standard setters not doing anything really substantively. Some issuing non-authoritative type of materials, educational materials. Found that also with PAOs to some extent, certainly firms doing internal work in that area. But out of that type of interaction and inquiry we made, we really did not come across anything that indicated that there were new issues that the working group had not already identified. We also did, as mentioned earlier, and as the board will be aware, we have monitored the AICPA Audit Evidence Project throughout its duration. I think key observations that we took away from the AICPA project was, first of all, that standard was finalized in May 21st, so not too long ago. It'll be effective for private company audits in the U.S. for calendar 2022 audits. But you kind of hear some of the same things that we heard in our outreach. So it includes things like explaining the role of professional skepticism and judgment in audit evidence, expanding on the concepts of corroborative, contradictory, and inconsistent evidence. The IAASB project did develop the attributes and factors of information to be used when evaluating, specifically the reliability. So I've mentioned some of those factors previously. I think ones that were added that are not traditionally maybe included in standards were considering susceptibility to bias, authenticity, and the source, the credibility of the source. So there were various aspects that were incorporated in the AICPA project. But again, I think you can look at Appendix 7, includes how the basic or primary observations coming out of the AICPA project tie to actually we have in Appendix 4, the main themes. And you'll see that there was nothing new really there from the issues that we had already identified. And then in section 4 of the paper, we also looked at some other sources of information. We, of course, took into account the IAASB strategy and work plan around these matters that respondents to those consultations had indicated projects should be undertaken with respect to audit evidence. We looked at some older papers, more conceptual papers that had been written and issued back when ISA 500 was originally issued. I think those older more conceptual papers will be valuable as a source to consult with the working group as we go forward, because they do articulate some conceptual underpinnings that I don't think we have any intention of losing as we go forward. So that'll be good to look at. And then lastly, we also looked at the work of the professional skepticism working group and how that can be incorporated or leveraged with respect to a project on addressing audit evidence. So that leads us to the next series of questions. Actually, we would like to take questions 2, 3, and 4. If we could go to the next slide, Armand, in the sequence here. So question 2 really deals with, based on academic research, etc., does list in Appendix 4 seem like it's right? 3 then picks up whether the monitoring of the national standard setters, particularly the AICPA project and other work going on, indicates Appendix 4 is right. And then the last question before we get to recommended actions is whether the board has any other information sources they think we should consult. And before anybody answers that, I just want to let everybody know that we have put a survey on the SpaceX rocket, and the astronauts on the Space Lab are answering that survey for us. So we think we've about exhausted our sources of information. But Tom, I hand back to you, interested particularly in these questions on academic research, monitoring activities, and then whether there's anything else we should be looking at.
Thanks. Fiona?
Thanks, Bob. Yes, yes, and no. They're the answers to my 3 questions.
It's very succinct and to the point. I appreciate that, Fiona. Roger?
Thanks, Bob. As you may imagine, I'll come in on the academic research. It's great to see it there, and well done, Kaiui, for putting that together. There is probably some other academic research which will not probably help scoping, but may help inform. There's a body of academic research, for example, around professional skepticism, and that would be beneficial perhaps as those areas go forward. I don't believe it changes at all the scoping or the priorities, and so yes, yes, and no are my answers too. Thank you.
Thank you. Consistent theme from a particular continent. Imran?
I think you're on mute, Imran.
Imran, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. I'm back. So a little bit to say on this, other than echoing the answers we've already had. My answer is also yes, yes, and no. In respect of the academic work, I thought we really should nod our heads to the outstanding way in which this has been done. We often ask for look at the academic work, but to have feedback in this way really gives the board confidence that everything's been looked at in a practical way, and I think in a very cost-effective way. Instead of commissioning research, but to have done it in this approach. So really grateful for this, and a wonderful example for when we have to reflect on research in future. And a lesson I took away from this as a national standard setter is that there is indeed a great need for closer coordination between our needs as national standard setters and the IAASB and what the actual researchers are focused on. Because it would have been so much more helpful if indeed they had work that was more targeted for what we are looking at. My second comment, which I hope Bob will offer us a response to, and it relates to what's covered under the heading United States AICPA, and it's from paragraphs 46 onwards of the paper, where you reference the AUC 500 work, and that has already been issued in the US. Bob, is there a sense you have about the extent to which what we're preparing is going to be inspired by what we've seen in AUC 500. I say this because AUC 500, when you first shared it with us, was really a very agreeable piece of work, and it seemed to address so much of what are the issues already out there. How has that changed, or how's your thinking around this changed in the last 6 months? So I appreciate hearing something, and no further comment on the last question other than my answer is no there. Thank you.
Okay, Julie.
Question 2, yes. Question 3, yes. And question 4, no, Bob.
Thank you, Julie. Rich?
Well, the short answers would be yes, yes, and no. But I just on question 2, as I said before, no issue with the list of issues. But again, nervousness about the breadth of scope of the project and the need to be targeted to make sure that we really achieve that objective. And then on question 3, very much agree with again the list, but also agree that we need to stay close to national standard setters and regulators. And I think it's really important that we make sure that what we end up with is generally accepted as what evidence is. And so that, to point one out, that we're not in conflict, or at least seriously in conflict with someone such as the PCOB. It would be difficult to have to explain, to clients, well, yes, we think this is enough for an ISA audit, but we have to go further for the fact that we also have to do a PCOB audit. And, it's always a difficult discussion. We have this thing open. I think we should see if there's a way that we can close that as best we can. Thanks.
Thanks. Sue?
Thank you. I'm also yes, yes, and no. And just an observation that I'm really interested to learn more about the AICPA project and perhaps see the extent to which we can use some of the intelligence and discussions that have gone on in getting to the conclusions that they have done. Thank you.
Thank you. Chun-Li?
Thank you. It's yes, yes, and no as well, like others. Just one further comment, and maybe building a little bit on what Imran has said on the academic research. And as I was reading it, and I think came through in Bob's presentation as well, it looks like we are hoping that the academic research will review other stuff. We were hoping that academic research will address certain issues. And I do wonder if there's opportunity for IAASB through maybe the AE working group to more actively engage and potentially influence research agenda by the academic community. Of course, recognizing that there are very progressive, very open-minded members within the community, like our very own Professor Kaiwu and Professor Roger. There may be some others who will benefit from the broader, more practical multi-stakeholders perspective that AEWG can bring. So in the course of the work, it may be worth spelling out a few specific topics that we want to encourage the academic community to consider undertaking research on. Just one other very small comment. On paragraph 37, I think that line, it says that auditing profession have yet to take advantage of these innovation. And for example, by integrating technology into auditing standards, I sort of took a pause at that sentence, and I may be reading a little bit too much into it, but it seems to infer that the standard setters are part of the auditing profession. And of course, well, especially IAASB, we are not. And I did not trace back to where this come from, but I guess where we see such misperception, maybe there's an opportunity for us to set the record straight here. That'll be all my comments. Thanks.
Hey, Shelley. Kai Martin?
And like others, yes, yes, and no.
Okay. Josephine, I hope you're not breaking up our yes, yes, and no.
Yes, yes, and no.
Oh, that's awesome. Consistent themes, globally shared. Bob, back to you. I could summarize that one pretty easily. There were lots of yes, yes, and no's in that order.
Yeah, thank you, and that's much appreciated. Always great to hear the consistency, especially when it's positive. Maybe just a couple of things. With the academic research, I think one of the challenges the board has, and this is something that Roger and Kaiui could help us with, is I know in our own jurisdiction we struggle with this. We want to use academic research and leverage it. But for example, if the IAASB is starting a project, to commission research when the project is starting, academic research takes quite some time to work through the appropriate processes and the appropriate reviews and publish and those sorts of things. So I think if we could, perhaps, this is just me personally, if we could work a little more closely, for example, with Roger and Kaiui, to maybe work on some ways that we could utilize our academics more in our projects. I think that would be great. Imran, you had a question. Sue mentioned it also, the AICPA project. How do we view this? I think clearly it was the project that was real life and going on concurrently with this project. So the working group actually stayed abreast of it as it was working through due process in the US. We shared agenda papers. Actually, Eric and Susan were members of our AICPA Audit Evidence task force. So we had that going for us. I would just say this about the AICPA project. I think it certainly is something to look at, and there probably are some lessons to learn from the process that we went through. But at the end of the day, we in the U.S. never would have undertaken a project that we felt was going to diverge from the requirements in ISA 500, and we continued that theme consistently through the project, and it was one of the conditions upon which our Auditing Standards Board approved and finalized that standard. So we believe that the standard is consistent with the requirements in ISA 500, as well as the PCAOB. The U.S. project expands and goes deeper and probably modernizes the standard a little bit. And I think those are some elements we can take away, but it's not intended to be a model for what we do with the Audit Evidence project on the ISA side. It's just information that we can use and learn from. So I hope that's clear for everyone. So Tom, I think that takes us to the point of through the first 4 sections, which really brings us to recommended actions. At this point, if we wanted to take a break, it would probably be a good point, but I'll defer to you.
Let me look at, this is the last question as I understand, and the paper lays out the actions pretty succinctly and clearly so far, and there hasn't been a lot of objections to what the group has done. The question I have for you is, my guess is that we would get this done we have an hour and a half left. We don't require the hour and a half. Do people want to plow through this question now or take a 10-minute break? I think lots of people waving their heads, but plow it through. What I suggest, if you have to step away, step away. If you have to step away and you want to make sure you get on the record on this one, ping me, and I'll make sure that you'll have an opportunity when you come back. But I think we could probably, based upon the momentum of the meeting, continue on this and assume that the very clear recommendations were read. So I turn it back to you, Bob, for a second.
I'm ecstatic to continue. I don't want anybody to reconsider at this point over a break. So yes, we'll keep rolling. And I think the discussion has been tremendous thus far. If we do go to the recommended actions, and of course this is section 5 of the paper, and we've had some discussion around this already. You know, Appendix 4, again, going back is key. That is the comprehensive list of issues that we believe as a working group should be considered for inclusion in a project or in a project proposal to undertake a project to revise ISA 500, including conforming and consequential amendments to other standards, and then also considering some of those topics to be candidates for the issuance or publication of non-authoritative support material while the standard setting project is underway, and then incorporated into the ultimate standard setting project. Some of that non-authoritative support material could already is or could be taken up by the technology working group, especially if it is more directly technology related. So again, Appendix 4 is critical. Appendix 5, you know, is all of the issues that we've identified. That is I'll call it the laundry list of everything that we put together. And when you look at Appendix 5, if it's in Category 1, then it's included in our project that we're proposing. If it's Category 2, it's also in scope for our project. It was just something that we hadn't originally identified. And as touched on briefly, Category 3 are the topics that we believe we should defer because they may require more fundamental revisions to other standards. In other words, it would be a perceived increase in scope creep for this project to start taking on some of those other topics. They range from the 330 to 501. Certainly substantive analytic procedures with data analytics and things like that could be taken up. Audit sampling could be taken up. But we believe that, or the working group is recommending that those be considered on the board's forward agenda for separate projects at some point in time, and be an element of what we plan to do now. So Tom, that leads us to the final question, question 5, if we want to go to that, Armand. And that simply is the working group's recommendation is that we would like to proceed with a standard setting project to revise ISA 500 and make necessary and consequential changes, amendments to other standards, and as reflected in Appendix 4, those topics, and also incorporate or produce non-authoritative support material where appropriate in the interim. So that is our proposal. What we would ask specifically from the board then is direction for the working group to go away, develop the project proposal, reflecting these recommended actions with the expectation that we would come back in December for approval, formal approval of that project plan. And in the meantime, allow us as a working group to progress some of this more detailed analysis that we need to undertake while waiting for formal approval of the project plan. Tom, that's the question we have for the final question of this session for the board, so I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Fiona?
That was very clever, Bob. You were totally frozen for the entire time you spoke, and as soon as you stop, the videos come back and you're moving again. It's like you're alive. My answer is yes, absolutely, 100% in the affirmative. Let's go.
Thank you. Fernando?
Yes, Bob, full support.
Thank you. Sachika?
Thank you. I also strongly support the direction. I mean, prepare a project proposal in December 2020. But one sort of worry I have is perhaps similar to Rich and Julie commented for previous question, is that there are a lot of action items. So I wonder whether there is a way to narrowing down, prioritizing sort of significant issues among those items and begin with, kind of higher priority items so that we could bring about the result at the right timing. And relating to that point, other recommendation I could have is that perhaps we could consider issuing sort of internal report document, such as project update that was issued by 600 project by summarizing the outcome at certain timing during the 500 revision project, so that we can issue some sort of initial outcome to the public. But overall, I really support start the project. I think now is the time to start. So thank you.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yes, I support the way forward as proposed. I, however, have a comment on point 11 of Appendix 4, which deals with going concern and the consequence of the new source of information on the assessment of going concern. Now that we know that we have a dedicated working group task force starting to work on the revision of ISA 570, I think this point could be a good candidate to be dealt with by another group in connection, of course, with the group on ISA 500. But if we want to reduce the list of topics, this one could be a good candidate to be outsourced to another group. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Sue?
Thank you. Strong support also to progress, and also just wondering whether there might be an opportunity to think about ways in which some of the B category things could be outsourced to other groups to keep momentum going on those. Thank you.
Chun-Li?
Thank you, Tom. Bob is a strong support. Let's go as well from me. But maybe a little bit to Sachiko's point, and as a follow-up to the point that I raised at the very beginning of this call. Thanks for your clarification that the category B is actually B plus A. I didn't quite read it that way. And when I look at paragraph 60, it didn't come across that way as well. And I certainly didn't look through the Appendix 4 through that lens. Because when I looked through Appendix 4, I was thinking the category A rather than B, some of which can have a class B. So maybe I need time to go back and read that again. And I do think a lot of the issues that are in A can't really wait for us to progress through 500. I think a lot of these, as I said earlier, living and breathing issues that people are really seeking guidance on. And it would really be helpful if we can consider issuing non-authoritative guidance or in some form addressing some of those needs in the interim while we progress with that piece of work. So just something for us to think about and to really consider. But otherwise, definitely supportive of what's been laid out. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Imran?
Thank you. I support the question in question 5. I want to say 3 or 4 things in relation to it, though. I think that strategically, this is a very important moment for our board. Tom, it realizes a promise that we've made in our recently published strategy, but I think it also realizes direction and hints we gave in even our previous strategy, the one that ended in 2019, going back to when we had, Bob will remember, the info working group, the innovation working group, and really the time has come for us to support the project proposal to support the drafting of a project proposal. I wonder, as we think about the name of what we're doing, Bob, in this new age, whether there is any scope for some innovation in relation to how we message a project about audit evidence, so that a broad stakeholder group understands that a project about audit evidence also absorbs so many of the other topics that people have been writing to us about, which others may just describe as merely technology topics. And so what Tom gets then in respect of his outreach on it is a lot of goodwill generated. That in fact, the Audit Evidence Project subsumes a whole lot of other issues that we've been talking about for a long, long time. Bob, I also vote for the red shirt. I think you should wear the red shirt again when we have the December meeting to vote out the project proposal. Thank you very much.
Sort of like Tiger Woods on a Sunday afternoon. He always likes to wear a red shirt to bring himself a championship. Len?
Yeah, thank you. Bob, fully supportive of the direction suggested by the task force. I would like to support what Sachiko says about a project update. It doesn't have to be long like the 600 project update we did a couple of years ago, but I think it would be useful. The reason being, we've done a lot of outreach, so a lot of anticipation in the marketplace by several national standard setters, regulators, and other stakeholders. So I know the timing probably too close to the December project proposal, but I think it kind of concludes what we have done so far, all the good work. I think it's good to have a very short project update, at least to the marketplace. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Kai Morton?
Thank you, and full support.
Thank you. Lynn?
I support the proposals put forward by the working group in question 5.
Thank you. Jim Jalkin?
Thank you, Tom. I just wanted to reflect for Bob what some of the discussion was at the CAG meeting, and specifically there was support for project and almost a sense of urgency that this moved forward. And also there was some discussion, I think perhaps the IAASB has done, I mean, obviously since they have a standard, a fair amount of background work while they're in NSS. Some of that may be very informative and help speed the project forward. So that was essentially the discussion within the CAG. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim, for sharing that. Julie?
Thanks. And Bob, I've been one of the folks that I've said sort of along this journey that I didn't think 500 was broken. So you've heard that from me, but there's definitely improvements to make. And I think that you've got a lot of overwhelming support here and, evidence gathering, so to speak, that there's maybe a need for a project. So I am supportive of the project, maybe with two small caveats. One being, I think from what I understand about the AICPA project was that there needed to be a little bit of a filter on some of the issues to make sure you got the biggest bang for your buck. So there's probably a shorter list of items that are in Appendix 4 that probably hit hit a lot of the key things that people are looking for. So maybe it might just be something the working group could consider prioritizing them a little bit, just to get, like I said, if we touched on these 5, this would give us, the broader coverage for what people are looking for. And then I guess just a little caution that I think there could be a lot of like spider legs out to the different standards depending on how you scope this. So it's just making sure that we try to confine it and ring fence it enough so that the project proposal is doable and it doesn't become like we don't have scope creep on the project proposal. So those would be my only 2 sort of. I'm just cautious about those 2 items. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Julie. Roger?
Yeah, I'll keep it short and sweet. I fully support. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Rich?
So like others, I support the project and maybe a little bit sounding like a broken record, but I do, like Julie, want to make sure we clearly scope this and make sure that we can get it into a manageable state. Having said that, I really do believe we need to go lock stock with the technology group to make sure that those issues are filtered in and being dealt with. Some of those will affect 500 itself. And lastly, like Sajiko and Len said, I do think a short project update would be a good idea. The amount of outreach that you've said today, Bob, is large, and I think the messages would be good to get out to the marketplace. Thanks.
Thank you. Josephine?
Bob, thank you. Yes, I fully support the project and the development of the project proposal. I also would like to support Julie's 2 cautions that she's expressed, and I also support the comment made by Sachiko, Len and Rich regarding an interim update. Thank you.
Thank you. It's the last of the hands. What I see is strong support for going ahead with this project. I think that's very clear guidance. I have to say my one big issue when I read the paper was to ensure that the scope of whatever we do is appropriately tight and ring fence. I think that was the whole purpose of the research, is we don't have to focus on every issue, but the ones that certainly are the most frequent with the biggest consequences, we should concentrate our efforts. So I think that's relevant to Julie's point and others that have raised about really ring fencing what we do appropriately for this. To me, when I read our strategy and all the input that went into it, it would be shocking if this project weren't on our agenda, but also we should incorporate this desire to be quick and agile into it. And if this all goes ahead as planned, when you think about the decision we made for LCE and now on audit evidence, and with things starting to roll off as we plan, you could see our strategy is really taking place. Like we're being very responsive to the challenges that we identified, and our new agenda is taking hold. So to me, I'm pleased with the direction that the working group has proposed and that the board has supported it. The only other person I'd like to ask if she had a comment is Karen, if you're on the call, just from anything from a PIOB perspective.
Thanks very much. I think that this was a great discussion and obviously a lot of support. And I think from a public interest perspective, moving as quickly as possible to address the need is important. And of course, this has a tie to professional skepticism, which is a key public interest. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Okay, Bob, I turn it back to you. Just any reaction, but basically take it my summary as sort of where unless people want to add to it, as the board advice to the working group.
No, thanks, Tom. I know quit while you're ahead, right? So not going to expand too much. I would just recognize the concerns about scope. That absolutely agree with that. I think actually, if you look at Appendix 4, the working group has looked at that. There's actually several of those items that potentially could be collapsed kind of into a more common issue to address. So there's a lot of detail there. So maybe it's not as long as expansive as it appears, but we will certainly take a look at prioritizing that. And Imran, the other thing is we will look at some sort of a project update. We'll talk to Phil and Brett and Jasper about possibly doing that. I think that's a good idea. And Imran, with respect to the red shirt, Tom, I'll take the Tiger Woods thing. Actually, when I got up this morning and put it on, I was thinking about taking it back off, because the first thing that came to mind was a matador waving a red cape in front of a bull. And I wasn't sure if that would be the case today, but thank you for the great feedback and input. And Armand, maybe if you just flip to the last slide, there is a little bit of a timeline here. I think we've talked about coming back in December for see how that would lay out tentatively at this point with the forward agenda, ultimately leading to hopefully an approval of an exposure draft in December of 2021, so about 18 months from now. But that's what we will shoot for. And with that, Tom, again, just thanks for all the great comments and thank the working group as well as the staff for all the great work on this.
Thank you. Any other comments today? I'm going to give people back the time. We have a quite important session tomorrow, and we'll be up bright and early on the East Coast for this one in the United States. Chunwei, you could get to laugh at us a little bit tomorrow, and it's a little bit of payback for what we did to you yesterday. Imran, I'm glad your new TA has joined you for the meeting. Hello. So have a great rest of the day or evening, wherever you are. Thank you for the supported conversation, good feedback. Congratulations to the working group for progressing this. I look forward to moving this through our board work plan quickly so we can get standard setting done in a responsive fashion. So thank you, and I'll speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.